Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the renowned scholar and poet, writes in his book The Kuzari that every Jew in every generation is capable of recognizing that the exodus from Egypt is absolute fact, as if he were present there himself. The question is, how can this be done? On one hand, many of the events and personalities of the past became axioms that have established today's thinking. People such as Alexander the Great and Nebuchadnezzar, as well as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, are known in every corner of the world. Their accomplishments and the fruits of their labor are the foundation of our intellectual, scientific, and technological advancements. These personalities and events are accepted as a fact, even though there is no one alive today that have seen these people nor experienced any of these events. By contrast, in relation to the events that happened to the Jewish people, doubts and questions are raised despite the proofs and conclusive documentation that exist concerning the birth of our nation. There is nothing surprising in this. We see today that some deny the Holocaust, even though there still live among us thousands of people who can testify personally, and many thousands more who are no longer with us who did manage to testify in their lifetime. The reason for this is simple. Those who try to deny the Holocaust are those who want to avoid its implications. Historical events like the Exodus from Egypt create obligations. It is convenient, therefore, for people to ignore them. Let's look at the facts. When traces of past events appear in archaeological excavations, ancient literature, or art forms from a particular period of history, we have significant proof of that event's authenticity. Even more convincing is proof that based on the intensive transmission of nations' collective experience. Events that live with the people, whose details are passed from generation to generation, are best of proofs. The foundation of the Jewish people, namely the occurrences in Egypt and their wanderings in desert, enjoy these two types of proofs and celebrate the birth of the Jewish nation, the festival of Passover. Today, archaeological research is slowly but surely discovering the events of the Torah in the depth of the earth. Thanks to pottery and papyruses, artifacts and remains, events are coming to life for archaeologists and historians. Parallel sources have been found that describe what happened from the point of view of Egyptians, the Assyrians, or the Canaanites. One of the most impressive findings is an Egyptian papyrus containing a lamentation by an Egyptian poet named Ipoar that describes the 10 plagues. This papyrus is part of Egyptian collection in the Museum of Leiden in Holland. It was translated into English in 1909. The papyrus describes a condition of desolation and destruction that befell the Egyptian early kingdom. The papyrus's description of the terrible catastrophes which befell the Egyptians is riveting, and the resemblance to the biblical story of the Exodus from Egypt leaves the observer with his mouth open. Plagues throughout the land, blood everywhere. The river is blood, men thirst for water. All the beasts cry in their hearts, the cattle low. Everything is ruined that yesterday was yet seen. The land is left as after flax harvest. The sons of princes were thrown over the walls. The prisons were destroyed. There was a great outcry in Egypt. It is interesting that the papyrus tells how the female slaves wear their mistress's jewels, just as it is written in the book of Shmos. Every woman shall borrow from her neighbor and from one who lives in her house silver jewelry and gold jewelry and dresses. Professor Emanuel Velikovsky and other experts are convinced that the time of the writing of the papyrus is parallel to the Bible's exodus from Egypt. In his book Ages and Chaos, Velikovsky tells about a stone found on the Egyptian border near El Arish, which was used as a feeding trough for cattle. On the stone is a hieroglyphic inscription that virtually describes the plague of darkness. It says, "The land was very stricken, evil was its portion. There was a great riot in the palace. During the days of the riot there was a storm so great that neither God nor man saw another's face." It continues to describe the march of Pharaoh and his army, and there it says that they reached a place called Pi HaHiroth, just as it is written in Torah. The children of Israel camped facing Pi HaHiroth, Book of Shmos. Professor Yehoshua Etzion, in his book The Lost Tanakh, describes the findings that show that the children of Israel did indeed carry out a long march in the desert. The researchers discovered remains of the settlements that held larger number of people, but which in their opinion were not occupied for more than one generation. We know from Torah that Jewish people spent only 40 years in the desert. The most remarkable finding is the large number of graves, but interestingly enough, no remains of source of water or granaries. In addition, the artifacts whose remains were found are in accord with the period during which the children of Israel were in Egypt. Etzion explains, "The children of Israel left Egypt, and in their bags were artifacts from the time they were in Egypt. These are the artifacts that were found in the desert. The many graves are the graves of those who died in the desert. It is also understandable why reservoirs and granaries were not found, since they ate dew and drank water from a miraculous well. The exodus from Egypt and the sojourn in the desert are indeed well documented. History and archaeology substantiate the biblical account of the exodus from Egypt." How does the story of an event pass from generation to generation without becoming distorted? How can we verify the details were not added in the course of generations? The answer is that protective devices are built in, sufficient to guarantee and ensure that there will be no changes in the course of the transmission of the message. The Torah was transmitted from generation to generation in unbroken historical continuity. Historical continuity is the key word in historical investigation and is the principal reason for seeing events in the past as facts. The events in the Torah were witnessed by masses and passed down to this day with intensive historical continuity, the likes of which are not found in any other nation or language, nor found concerning any other story. The historical continuity of the transmission of the Torah is well dated. We know who the leaders of each generation were, their names, what dates they led the nation, on what date each one died, and to whom they passed on the staff of leadership of the generation to follow. Such historical continuity, so clear and intense by itself, makes any attempt to implant a story that didn't occur as impossible undertaking. The Torah is transmitted in exhaustive detail. It abounds in exact dates and numbers. Even the number of fighting men in every tribe is recorded. In contrast, historical stories that have been reconstructed are characterized by round dates and round numbers. The exodus from Egypt was witnessed by an enormous mass of people. These people recounted their stories to their children, who in turn recounted it to their children. These testimonies are learned and learned again every day in the course of history. The commandment of the Torah, "and you shall teach it to your children," is the protective device that ensures that a day does not pass without hundreds of Jewish children and their parents and teachers being involved with the study of the Torah. In addition, the stories were passed on from generation to generation in an intellectual continuity that is linked to activities that are performed every day in every generation. Tefillin is but one example of such an activity. It is a protective device of transmission. Our men put on the same tefillin in the same exact manner as our ancestors did. Every 13-year-old boy receives his own set of tefillin and puts them on in the same way as he sees his fathers doing it. In due time, the boy will then teach his son how to do the same, and so on. Transmission with no change. There's a whole system of activities, mitzvahs, that are performed continuously from generation to generation. How is it possible to introduce even the smallest changes into a system that is transmitted in the midst of ceaseless activities? The transmitters of the Torah regarded every minute detail with the utmost seriousness. Rabbi Shmuel said to his student Rabbi Meir, who was a scribe, who wrote Torah scrolls and tefillin, "My son, be vigilant in your work, for your work is work of heaven, lest you omit a single letter or add a single letter and thereby destroy the entire world." These leaders and scribes, transmitters of the Torah, understood the awesome responsibility of their function and were prepared to make every effort to hand down the Torah in its exact form. They succeeded in their task exceptionally well. For after all, the Torah is copied by human beings, and since the Torah contains more than 300,000 letters, there is a significant possibility of introducing errors every time the Torah document is copied. After a number of years, one may expect that there will be many versions that differ from each other in letters or even words. Our Torah was preserved in its entirety, in every community and in every diaspora of Israel, without any significant differences. The transmission of the testimony down through the generations is not by just one community of our nation, but by a network of communities that are spread over the face of the earth. Some were disconnected from each other during many hundreds of years, and nonetheless, in the end, all of them returned with the same written Torah, the same oral Torah, the same 613 commandments, mitzvahs, and the same principles of faith. It is not possible that an identical change occurred in all of them in the same time. Judaism has developed powerful motivation to pass on the message of Torah exactly and speaks much of the merits of those who learn Torah and transmit it with great accuracy. To our great sorrow, the Jewish people proved their devotion to the God of Israel and the Torah of Israel with their blood. Their commitment was so great that neither Christians nor Muslims, neither harsh kings nor their harsh edicts could destroy it. Many are stories of self-sacrifice that accompany Jewish history. Even in our generation, during the darkest hours of the Holocaust, Jews showed heroic perseverance and adherence to all the Torah's commandments. The accounts are not mere stories of bravery that testify to the character of this nation and its faithfulness to its values. These stories also constitute proof of the exactness of the transmission of the Torah. When the festival of Passover comes every spring, and we sit at the Seder table, we eat the same matzah and bitter herbs and drink the same 4 cups of wine as was done in all the generations before us. We read from the Agoda and retell the story of the exodus of our people from the land of Egypt and the birth of our nation. And we know with certainty that all the things written in the Agoda, whose symbols are arrayed on the table before us, existed not only in the past, but are living and enduring in our hearts today, as they will forever.